Thank you very much, Dr. Quinlivan. I'd now like to ask Professor Deiric O'Brien, please, from Dublin City University. Thank you.
That's great, thank you. I'm very struck that a Meath man is following a Cork man telling people in Dublin how to organise the city. County. I promise to do my best. So I'll kick off. Really, today is sort of a very sort of establishment setting day, get a sense of actually what's happening, how do we get to where we are now, and once we have a better understanding of how we got here, where do we go from here and how best do we get there. So I have called this Dublin, all of it is different, because actually of a conversation I had with a Dublin councillor about 4 weeks ago, who I was making a point that actually we get so obsessed with actually making change in Dublin, and we always see Dublin as different, that maybe we should just take the point that actually Dublin isn't that different, and we should treat local democracy and local government across Ireland the same. Now, in his defence, he was right and I was wrong. Dublin is different, and all of it, in its many parts, is different, and that's why you get the sort of odd title here today. So some of this will just recap on sort of roots point, to sort of speak to Dublin's differences. So it's a capital city, and it's a capital city in a very centralised system. And to reiterate A's point about the sort of the inglory of being 38 out of 39 systems, that centralisation is something we're going to come back to again and again, probably in the coming sessions. In addition to being sort of a capital city, to reiterate and sort of speak to roots points, it's a capital city that had a number of very strong towns or suburbs in its immediate vicinity. And that's shaped the way the system of government for the city and county has evolved, particularly over the last 125 years. In addition to being centralised and being a capital city, it speaks to roots point about being a primate city. It's the centre of the national economy. It's the centre of our legal system, our commercial systems, our professional systems. They're nearly all based in Ireland, whether it's the Law Society or the Bar Council or the Planning Institute or our medical professional bodies. They're based in Dublin. It's the centre of our religious systems and traditions and faith traditions, with noble exception of Armagh. Dublin tends to be the most significant element even within our faith communities, and particularly around infrastructure. It's the infrastructural centre and capital of the island. If you think about Dublin Airport, the M50, these are key pieces of national infrastructure, and they're embedded in the area of Dublin. And the same, when Roddy spoke about culture, it's arguably the key element of cultural production within Ireland. So one of the points for you as we go through the coming months is to bear in mind, it's difficult, but it's probably not helpful to compare Dublin to other cities on the island. It is different, it is distinct. Its history has created those differences and those distinctive elements. While preparing for this, it was hard to really speak to the history of difference in the local government system in Ireland. And I came across this quote. Now, we've been warned not to have too many quotes on our slides and to sort of keep lots of little text, but I just thought this was amazing. So it's a quote from a report in 1907 that looked at local government systems in major cities in the UK and then compared them back to the old townships, sort of the non-corporation parts of the Dublin local government system. And that idea of a cradle-to-grave range of services. So, corporation and the townships, it offers that the child is brought safely into the world. It provides them in infancy with suitable food. It gives them playgrounds to amuse himself and baths to swim in. It takes them to school. It trains them for future work. It sees that the citizen's house is properly built. It's got a regulatory function. It sometimes even builds it for him. It has a housing function. It brings into his home an unfailing supply of pure water from the remote hills. It guards his food safety. It tries to make sure the food is secured and it's not dangerously adulterated. It sweeps the streets for him. It disposes of the refuge from his house. Now, we all know that's changed. It carries him swiftly to and from work. It gives him good books to read, which still happens. Pictures to look at, which still happens. Music to listen to, which still happens. And lectures to simulate his thought, which still happens. So if you think about, the sort of the cultural activities, the learning activities that still happen in the city, I just thought it was very, very striking that here we have something 115 years ago that remains as relevant and important to our discussions and deliberations today and in the coming months. And the point, and something that I hope you take on board as we go on, if Dublin's local government was different and distinct in 1907, local government in Dublin remains different in the range of services it provides, the complexity of the challenges it faces, and the population it serves. So if we think a little about the history, and again, it's a flying visit. As Ruth mentioned, we've actually had a mayor since 1229, our first Lord Mayor in 1665. But the modern sort of recognisable system of government springs from 1898, and A spoke to that. So that's our modern recognisable system of the city and the county. Very quickly, we began to see the incorporation of those separate town governments. In 1900, in Drumcondra, Clontarf and Kilmainham, which actually retained their own systems, and then again up to 1930, where Rathmines, Rathgar and Ranelagh were brought into the system. And you can still see those town halls in Dublin. I think Pembroke Town Hall is used by the City of Dublin Education and Training Board, and Rathmines Town Hall is also used by the Education and Training Boards. And they're beautiful municipal buildings that speak to a civic pride in that town, okay? There were Dubliners, but they were also proud of their Rathmines or Ranelagh or Clontarf local government. In terms of the county, really the modern system, we really see it coming to sort of the recognisable shape again in 1898. And relatively little change until the 1960s. So Ruth talked about the sort of the suburban development. But if for those from the sort of the South Dublin or Fingal or Dunleary Rathdown, particularly Fingal and South Dublin, if you look at really back in, it's the 60s, you really see that significant expansion. So a guy called Miles Wright was brought in by the Department of Local Government and Planning to do a report on the creation of new towns. And he produces his report in 1966 or 67, and it leads to the development of 3 new significant developments. So Blanchardstown, Lucan, or 4, Clondalkin and Tallaght. The chairperson's conversation with Clondalkin this morning actually really got me. So that's one of the reasons we see such development was coming from that planning report. And again, has ramifications for how the city and county are governed, because you have the massive increase in population in what were relatively unpopulated areas. So those from Fingal, you might remember, Blanchardstown still had a shop that had a thatched roof into the 1980s, okay? And I think even into the early 1990s. So that was a reflection of rapid social and population change in a relatively short space of time. In the 70s and 80s, we have a key era of change and challenges for local government in Dublin. In addition to sort of the radical economic restructuring, often coming from the oil crisis and the challenge of unemployment. And one of the examples I give when I talk about that type of change, I don't know if there's anybody here from Finglas and James, there's a place called Jamestown Road. Now, in the early 1970s, Jamestown Road in Finglas had 8,000 people walking to work. Every morning at 8 a.m., 8,000 people went to work on 3 or 4 factories there. Unidair, there was a major bakery, Wesso steel manufacturers, and Tinsley steel products. By the late 1970s, that was into the hundreds. That's the scale of economic change we're talking about. And yet again, it has massive implications for the way we govern the city and the county. We also see the emergence of significant flaws in our planning for housing and the housing developments. So one of the things we see is some of our housing developments in the 60s actually works quite well when you had high rates of unemployment. It implodes and collapses when unemployment becomes a major issue. And Ballymun is seen as the classic example actually it functioned as a housing development quite well, probably into the mid to late 1970s. We see the emergence of what planners or sociologists talk about, the wicked issues of complex social problems, where health, educational attainment, well-being, crime, housing, all become integrated and complex and very, very difficult to address. There was a recognition, particularly into the early 1980s, that the current local government arrangements were really straining. So if you look outside of the city, what was the old county? You had Fingal, South Dublin, and Dún Laoghaire-Rathdown. We see the creation of 3 new electoral counties in 1985. So you still had 78 councillors, and bear in mind that's the second largest democratic assembly outside of Dáil Éireann. It's really straining by the 1970s and 80s. The initial reform in 85, and then you see the creation of these new counties in 1994, and sort of the creation of a county model of government in Dublin, which is something we didn't really have before. And again, it's something to think about under your own terms of reference as we go forward. Has it served a purpose? To what extent it has been successful? Is it time to think about how we might do it differently? Bear in mind, this is not our first rodeo. We've been here before looking at new models of governance for Dublin. There's been that recognition of the flaws. They've been there quite a while. So we had proposals in 01 and 03 to put in a directly elected mayor that were passed and then removed 2 years later. We had a major green paper and bill that lapsed in 2010 as the government fell. And then the Local Government Act in 2014 provided, if you'll see the sign there, for a directly elected mayor. Now, one of the issues arguably then was that it's not just about the model of election. So it's not just whether the councillors elect a mayor, it's the powers the local authority has, it's the powers the mayor has. So I think that's a key issue, just to reiterate A's point, is to constantly go back to that idea of the powers, the functions and the finance. What will a mayor be able to do? What will the local authority be able to do? What will the councillors be able to do? And how is it paid for? Okay, so to keep coming back to those, sometimes they talk about the 3 Fs, form, function, and finance. So I suppose some concluding thoughts before the shepherd's crook takes me off. Dublin is different in a variety of ways. It's now served by 4 local authorities. All have broadly similar challenges. You've heard some of them articulated here today, and again, some unique problems. They're actively collaborating in some areas of policy, but they're removed from seemingly obvious areas of policy. Transport is one that springs to mind. Health, what we might call community safety, the role of the guards. Welfare, often quite significant areas of work in other European local authorities. They're quite distinct in the Irish system, where they're removed from local authority control. So you see the creation of sometimes ad hoc or structured relationships with other public service providers to do something that actually in most other systems is done much more simply. Education is a very interesting one. So we have education and training boards that are actually based on our county system. Councillors sit on them, but they're actually distinct from city and county councils. So I'll leave it with the application of the county council local government model in Dublin is nearly 30 years old. And it still remains unclear how Dubliners view their city and county or counties. So I will leave it at that. Thank you.